Alrighty, welcome back to, oh my gosh, my headset cables are tangled. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I am your intrepid narrator Fraggeth, and today we're doing some Destination Void by Frank Herbert. And this is the cover image of the August 1965 issue of Galaxy, in which was included Do I Wake or Dream? Which is kind of the origin point for Destination Void. It gets expanded on to become the book I hold before me, and you will shortly be listening to. Alrighty, so because I'm bad at math, we are going to be like 1 week off. I think. No, no, we're good. Never mind. I think we're good. Never mind. Forget it. I am completely lost in the space-time continuum. Time has been flying and been very elastic the last couple of months for me, so I'm like totally discombobulated. So previously on Destination Void, turns out that the aux unit was plugged into the ship systems and not separate. This unfortunately includes the AAT, and I can't remember what that stands for off the top of my head. I'm sure it's important. And it's mentioned very early on, and then they never say it out loud again. It's always AAT after that. And basically the AAT is kind of like a large language model that the ship uses in order to decipher the weakening signals from Moonbase and what's being said, and allows them to communicate with their origin point, and that is now highly unreliable at this point, now that the aux unit and its bizarre unknown capabilities has been plugged in. I flew through here to see if I can find what AAT stands for. Anyway, that's kind of the biggie. Tension is being ramped up in a big way. Oh dear, did I just? I sure think I did. No, I didn't. Oh, we're good. I totally lost my train of thought as I'm looking to see if I can find the definition, find what AAT stands for, and I can't. Suffice it to say, it's important, and they no longer have access to it. Well, they have access to it, but it's no longer reliable. Anyway, suffice it to say, they're in trouble. And they now have to be on the lookout for other issues that could arise, because they're very reliant on the ship's computer at this point. Because for navigation, they're able to do some from like the command and control room. But if they have to do absolutely everything by hand, it's a matter of time before everything goes to hell in a handbasket and they wind up killing themselves by accident because they just can't keep up. So they need an automated system to keep this stuff running, because it's just too much for the 4 of them. Let's see what we've got here. Yep, I didn't lose my page. We're good. I'm a little off today. I don't know what's going on. Hopefully, we'll get into the swing of this and be on again. Alrighty, let me have a little more water here, and we'll get rocking and a rolling. Chapter 19.
The cell has energies that oscillate and pulse with the tumult of living. We see reflections of this root activity in that coordinated cell structure which we commonly refer to as a human being. Have you ever watched a man tapping his finger nervously on a desktop? Have you ever timed the periodicity of the human eye blink? Breathing has characteristic rhythms for different conditions of the total cell structure. You must keep this in mind when you design devices to be used and occupied by this human bundle of cells. You must always remember the pulse and the needs of the component cells.
Vincent Frame, biochemist designer.
I'll use the shot effect generator again,
Bickle thought. He leaned into the organized clutter of the aux, clipped a lead onto the temporary input, threaded the lead out, and draped it to one side. The effect and the way to achieve it were still clear in his mind. Uh, Classic misreading a line which reverses its entire meaning. The effect and the way to achieve it were still clear in his mind. He had awakened suddenly, not knowing how long he had slept, but feeling refreshed, and with this answer filling his mind. He turned to the computer lead. Oh, that's right. That's the other thing, is Bickle's kind of gone off the rails a little bit and locked himself in the room with the aux unit. So they have to take him out. They have to at least stop him. And Timberlake, I believe, is going through life systems and has the deep-seated fear that if he looks into one of the hive tanks, there won't be anything in it. Meaning this entire thing is a sham. He turned to the computer leads, linked the aux through a buffer that would feed its impulses into a test memory bank, connected this to the new bank of neuron blocks, and put the system on full interlock.
Will you at least explain what you're doing, John?
Flattery's voice flowed out of the screen. Bickle glanced back, saw Prudence at the controls, Flattery sitting on the edge of an action couch. No sign of Timberlake. But this screen's eyes didn't expose all of Comm Central. It was probable that Timberlake was trying the hatch.
Well, let him. We have only ourselves to use as models for producing this consciousness function, Bickle said. And everybody keeps saying we can't get into ourselves the way an engineer should to duplicate the mechanism. But, friend, there's another approach, thoroughly tested and effective.
Prudence said,
Raj?
Flattery looked at her.
I'm getting current drift on the auxiliary power supply.
It's the shop, Flattery stated flatly.
John's taken a direct line to prevent us from shutting him off.
He looked back at Bickle.
Right. Right. It shouldn't cause you any trouble. I've isolated the line. Your main board is still functioning.
Bickle turned back to the aux, began tying in a series of timed neurofibers.
What's the tested, effective method?
Flattery looked up at the telltales on the Comm Central board, following Timberlake's progress by the heat sensors. Timberlake was out in the second zone now, turning in toward the opposite side of the shielding and the hive tanks.
Why was Tim so reluctant to go?
Flattery wondered. Bickle finished a triple connection along the timed fibers, straightened.
The system you can't tear apart and examine is called a black box. If we can make a white box sufficiently similar and general in potential to the black box, that is, make it sufficiently complex, then we can force the black box by its own operation to transfer its pattern of action to the white box. We cross-link them and subject each to identical shot effect bursts.
What's your white box? Flattery asked, his interest and attention caught in spite of his fears.
That thing?
He nodded toward the crazy block construction of the aux.
Hell no, this is nowhere near complex enough, but our entire computer system is.
He's gone crazy.
Flattery thought. He can't be suggesting seriously that he'd throw a scrambling short-effect burst into the computer. Again, Flattery glanced up at the telltales. Timberlake was at the edge of the hive tanks, moving at a maddeningly slow pace. Then, how does the Ox function in this? Flattery asked, returning his attention to the screen. This is our sorter, Bickle said. It sorts the rhythms of the system and acts as a crude set of frontal lobes. He linked two parts of his construction by cross-jacks in a patchboard. There, now to run a few tests. Shouldn't you wait? Flattery demanded. Shouldn't we discuss this a bit more? What if you've made a mistake and... No mistake, Bickle said. Flattery looked to the telltales. Timberlake was in the hive tanks now, but he wasn't moving, just stopped there. We set Bickle, our organ of analysis, at too high a pitch, Flattery thought. We should have known it could run wild. What was keeping Timberlake? Straight line test first, Bickle said, and closed a key on the computer wall. He stared at the diagnostic circuit dials above him. Flattery held his breath, turned slowly to look at the big board in front of Prudence. If Bickle's test loused up the central computer system, it'd show up first on the big board. The flashboard retained its quiet green. The steady ticking of relays through the graph counters and monitors held at an even pace. Everything appeared soothingly ordinary. I'm getting individual nerve net responses on the separate blocks, Bickle said. Flattery kept his attention on the flashboard. If Bickle ruined the computer, the ship was dead. Most of the Tin Egg's automatic systems depended on the computer's inner lines of communication and supervisory control programs. Didn't you hear me? Bickle demanded. Oh, jeez, sorry. Not getting enough oxygen to the brain or something. Didn't you hear me? Bickle demanded. I'm getting nerve net response. This thing will behave like a human nervous system. Raj, he is. It was Prudence. Flattery dropped his gaze to where she was pointing. She had shifted a small corner of her own auxiliary board into a repeater system tied to Bickle's diagnostic circuits. Beta rhythm, she said, pointing to the scope in the center of the board. Flattery watched the sign play of the green line on the scope. That's sign, S-I-N-E, digesting what Bickle had said, what the scope implied. Black box, white box. Perhaps it was possible, theoretically, to use the entire computer as a white box to take the transfer pattern called consciousness. But there remained many unanswered questions, and one was more vital than all the others. What do you intend using as a black box? Flattery asked. Where'll you get your original pattern? From a conscious human brain. I'm going to take one of our spare hive tanks and adapt the electroencephalographic feedback system as a man amplifier. He's utterly mad, Flattery thought. The short effect shock would kill the human subject. Bickle looked out of the screen, stared at Flattery, realizing that the psychiatrist chaplain had seen the possible deadliness of this proposal. Who will... Oh. Golly. Sorry. Who will bell the cat? Bickle thought. He swallowed. Well, if necessary, I will. How would you protect the subject from the shot effect bursts? Prudence asked. Curare? Even as she asked, she wondered how she was protecting herself from her own experiments. The answer was daunting. No better than Bickle would. What had made this crew so prone to all-or-nothing efforts? I believe the subject will have to be fully conscious, Bickle said, without any medication, or narco inhibitions. He waited for the explosion from Timberlake. This idea was sure to outrage the conditioning of the life systems engineer. Where was Timberlake? Absolutely not, Flattery exploded. It'd be murder! Or maybe suicide, Bickle said. Prudence looked away from the console, met Bickle's eyes. Be reasonable, John, she pleaded. You're already endangering the computer with that. The ship's still functioning, isn't it? Bickle countered. But if you throw a shot effect burst through that. She nodded toward the stacked board, blocks, and interwoven. I am getting lost. I swear the text is tilting funny. I don't know what's going on. I'm losing my mind. Oh no. But if you throw a shot effect burst through that. She nodded toward the stacked blocks and interwoven leads of the aux beside Bickle. How will you avoid damage to the computer's core memory? Core memory is a fixed system and buffered. I'll keep the aux potential below the buffer threshold. Besides, he shrugged, we've already put shot effect bursts through the computer without. And scattered information from hell to breakfast, she snapped. We can still find that information if we use the aux to sort the addresses for us, Bickle said. Flattery glanced at the sensors in front of Prudence. What was wrong with Timberlake? Was he injured? Unconscious? But the sensors revealed a narrow path of movement from the life systems engineer, all of it within the hive tank complex. If I understand you correctly, Prudence said, you'll have to add nerve net simulation channels to the aux until it and the computer are as complex as a human nervous system. As you build it and test it, we become more and more dependent on that jury-rigged aux monstrosity for our very lives. It has to have a full range of sensory apparatus, Bickle said. There's no other way. There must be, she said. Where'd you get such a mad idea? From you. Shock momentarily stilled her tongue. That's impossible. You're a female, Bickle pointed out, capable of biological reproduction of conscious life. In that method, you have a substrate of molecules that are capable of assuming a large number of forms, different forms. Those molecules assume a particular form in the presence of a molecule that already has that form. He shrugged. Black box, white box. I thought you meant from me personally, she said, looking up at the telltale sensors and seeing the apparently irrational movements of Timberlake. Look, Bickle said, unaware of their preoccupation, the basic behavior of the computer will remain intact. We won't interfere with supervisory programs or command constants. We want to set up a system dealing with probabilities, with mobility constant for the games theory, Flattery sneered. You can't predict all the behavior of your machine. He looked back at the telltales. What was Tim doing? What was Tim doing? That's just it, Bickle said. If the machine's going to be conscious, we can't predict all of its behavior. By the very nature of consciousness, by definition. Consciousness is a game where the permissible moves aren't arbitrarily established in advance. The sole object's to win. Anything goes, Flattery wondered. He focused suddenly on Bickle, recognizing the essentially blasphemous nature of such a concept. There had to be rules. The machine gets part of its personality from its creator, part from its opponents. Something from God, something from the devil, Flattery thought. There had to be essential error in this path, somewhere. Bickle was behaving far outside the predictions. Their organ of analysis was acting illogically. He was not making the best possible move each time. You'll introduce error factors and loss increment into the entire computer, Prudence cautioned. That's not only illogical, it's... She broke off, studied her board, made a pressure balance correction in the atmospheric recirculation system, and waited to see if the automatics could hold the new setting. You have to make the best possible move at all times, Flattery said. Your suggestion does not appear to... There you've hit it, Bickle agreed. Best possible move. Sometimes your best possible move is to make a dangerously poor move that changes the entire theoretical structure of the game. You change the game. What about all those lives down in the hive tanks? Prudence asked. Do they have any choice in this game? They already made their choice. And while they're helpless, you change the rules, Flattery said. That was one of the chances they accepted when they accepted hibernation, Bickle said. That was their choice. Flattery abandoned the argument, pushed himself off his action couch. What are you going to do? Prudence asked. Check on Tim. Where is Tim? Bickle asked. Down in the hive tanks, Flattery said, knowing Bickle could get the answer himself once he consulted the shop's repeaters. Deep in the hive tanks? Bickle asked. Of course. Prue, Bickle snapped. Try to raise him on the command circuit. She heard the urgency in Bickle's voice, whirled to obey. There was no response from Timberlake. You fools, Bickle said. Flattery stopped at the tube hatch, glared up at the screen. Who let him go down into the deep tanks? Bickle demanded. You blind idiots! Don't you know what he's likely to find down there? What do you mean? This whole damn ship's nothing but a simulation device, Bickle said. There'll be nothing down there except a few crew replacements. Those tanks have to be empty. He's wrong, Flattery thought. Or is he? The thought staggered Flattery. He saw immediately how that might pull the props out from under Timberlake, a man tuned as fine as the rest of them for a specific function. He'd still have the crew systems, Prudence said. She stared across the room at Flattery, feeling the loneliness. The tin egg with its programmed peril might contain only a few isolated humans launched into nowhere. They wouldn't, Flattery thought. But if they'd prepare me to cheat the rest of the crew... His feet felt rooted to the deck. He swallowed in a dry throat. But it's impossible. They promised me when I discovered the actual Tau Ceti records. If we succeeded, we could just send back the mess... Oh, my God. But it's impossible. They promised me when I discovered the actual Tau Ceti records. If we succeeded, we could just send back the message capsule and continue as... Raj, are you sick? Prudence asked. She studied him, seeing the lost, sunken look in his eyes. The Tau Ceti planets are uninhabitable, yes, Hempstead had admitted when confronted with the evidence. No Eden, but the universe is known to contain billions of inhabitable planets. You realize you can't come back here, of course. The danger to your hosts. The biopsy donors were all criminals, Flattery had said, springing his other suspicion. Brilliant people, but misdirected, Hempstead had protested. That is one of the reasons you can't come back, but nothing's to stop you from going on to explore and find your own Eden. Remembering the words, Flattery felt how hollow they sounded. Sham and trickery all the way, he thought. But why? Chapter 20. In a right-handed person, the so-called rational function operates mainly from the left hemisphere of the cerebral cortex. The intuitive operation, however, lives mainly in the right hemisphere. There is strong evidence for positive feedback between the two hemispheres operating along the corpus callosum. The substance of this interchange remains largely a mystery, but there can be no doubt that it serves an important function in consciousness. Morgan Hempstead, Lectures at Moonbase. Timberlake had launched himself down the communications tube with desperate haste, knowing he had to move swiftly or become stalled in terror. At the tube distribution lock, he sealed the hatch behind him, snatched a Robox monkey from its rack, tuned the sensors to the track imprinted in the tube wall, slammed its wheels onto the guide marks, and grabbed the handhold controls. Again he encountered that terrifying reluctance to move, and stared up at the tube, studying the long infinity curve of it visible through the transparent safety locks.
I can't go back, he thought. With a sudden wrench, he twisted the little rowbox tow unit's drive to full on, let it jerk him ahead, along that curving track. The wind of his passage was a dim hiss. He was like a loose piston driving down that tube. Driving down that tube? He was like a loose piston driving down that tube. Locks opened automatically to the rowbox signal, closed behind him. He slowed for the protective jog through the shielding layer, twisted around through the branching outside the hive tanks, dove back around along the flat angle that returned through the water shield, and stopped in the lock chamber to the tanks. He racked the rowbox, stared at the hatch. It was a big yellow oval, its seal warning in heavy blue letters. This hatch must be closed and dogged before inner hatch will open. Now that he was faced with it, Timberlake felt a calm submission to fate. He gripped the hatch dogs, broke the seal, seeing the line of frost inside as the hatch swung open. His suit generators hummed upscale, compensating for the drop in temperature as chill air spilled out of the lock. Timberlake slipped into the lock, closed and sealed the outer hatch, turned around. A rack of heavy-duty generators hung over the inner hatch with a big warning sign above them. Extreme danger. Deep space or LT suit required before entering the next lock. Be sure you have spare generator in working condition before opening this hatch. Timberlake looped the straps of a spare generator over his shoulder, gave the thing's turbine drive a short burst to check it. The generator hummed briefly. He swung the rack of them aside, broke open the next hatch, slipped through, and dogged it behind him. Now a smaller hatch greeted him, and lettered on its face, "Admission only to life systems engineers or medical personnel. Suit security must be maintained at all times beyond this point. Do not open this hatch until you have adjusted your suit for the extreme low of hibernation temperatures." Timberlake coupled the auxiliary generator to his suit, checked both generators, adjusted them for temperature security override. The remembered routine occupied his awareness, keeping his mind off the space beyond that hatch. Suit seals slithered under his gloved fingers as he secured them. He dropped the anti-fog viewplate over his faceplate, ran a check tape along the seals. The moment of final decision had come. Timberlake forced himself to act slowly and calmly. More than his own life depended on what he did now, he told himself. Stray heat inside there could play havoc with helpless lives. He passed his suit's baffles in front of a heat sensor, studied the gauge. 0. His gloved hands went to the dogs of the inner hatch, broke the seal. The hatch popped slightly, indicating a small difference in pressure. Nothing abnormal. He stepped through into the glittering dry chill of the first bank of hive tanks. This was where Prudence had been. He saw her empty tank on his left, its leads dangling, the cushioned carrier still open inside. Everything around him was revealed in harsh blue light. He studied the chamber. It was like a giant barrel, an open space in the center surrounded by the smaller barrels that were the individual hibernation tanks. A grid-floored catwalk led down the open center, with short ladders and handholds branching up to the separate tanks. Timberlake kicked off down the length of the tank in 3 low-grav jumps, caught a handhold beside the breaker lock that separated this section from the next one. He looked back. No, they weren't little barrels, he thought. They weren't little barrels, he thought. The individual tanks stretched away from him, all around, like so many sections of gray culvert pipe waiting to be assembled into something useful, like a drain. There was no point examining the tanks in here, he knew. This was the number 1 section, the high-priority crew replacements. If there was deception, it'd be farther along the line, in one of the deeper sections. Timberlake opened the safety valve at the breaker lock, swung open the hatch, let himself through, reset the mechanism to isolate the section in the event of partial damage. He looked around the new section. It was the twin of the other, except for the absence of a raided tank. Timberlake swallowed. His cheeks felt damp and cold. A place between his shoulder blades itched. Quite abruptly, he found himself remembering Professor Aldous Warren, the lecturer in biophysics back at UMB. He was a goat-bearded old man with a senile-sounding voice and a mind like a scimitar. Why do I think of old Warren now? Timberlake wondered. As though the question released a hidden awareness, he recalled the old man diverging from a seminar discussion to talk about moral strength. You wish to test moral strength? He'd asked. Simple. Construct a med computer with a public call box attachment. Set it so that anyone submitting to the computer's probes can find out within a day or so when he'll die. Of natural causes, of course. If you wish to call old age natural, then you step back and see who uses the thing. I'm going to repeat that because I mangled it. I apologize. We're having a day. You wish to test moral strength? He'd asked. Simple. Construct a med computer with a public call box attachment. Set it so that anyone submitting to the computer's probes can find out within a day or so when he'll die. Of natural causes, of course. If you wish to call old age natural, then you step back and see who uses the thing. Someone, a female student, had asked, Wouldn't it take a kind of courage not to use this computer? Pah! Old Warren had exploded. Another student had said, Hypothetical questions like this always bore the hell out of me. Sure, Old Warren had answered. You young toughs haven't faced the fact that we could build such a med computer right now, today. That we could build such a med computer right now, today. We've had the ability to build it for more than 30 years. It wouldn't even be very costly, as such things go. But we don't build it, because very few people, even among those who could build it, have the moral strength to use it. Timberlake held himself still and silent in the hive tank, realizing why he had remembered that incident. Coming into this cold, lighted tank was like using old Warren's hypothetical death predictor. Bickle infected me with the certainty that this ship is not what it seems to be, Timberlake thought. He took over command, pushed me aside. The only reason for being that was left me, he looked up and around the tank, was in here. If this is taken from me, then I'm truly useless, except as a kind of computer shop flunky for Bickle. Yes, Bickle. Right away, Bickle. Is there anything else, Bickle? With a sense of astonishment at how he had unconsciously dramatized the change of relationships within the crew, Timberlake rolled this realization over and over in his mind. There was a kind of pride in the awareness of his inner workings, the quirks his mind possessed, and an understanding that this stemmed in part from his conditioning. Presently, he launched himself up to an individual tank hanging low on the left center. The tank was like all the others, racked in curving rows around it. He activated the inner cold light, caught a handhold, and bent close to the tank's inspection port. The light flickered, glowed. It illuminated the metered master tubes dropping from the tank's other side, a color-coded sheaf of spaghetti that trailed down left and right to the figure under the light. A man's craggy profile lay there, waxy skin and faint black beard. He was like a mannequin figure, and Timberlake thought immediately of elaborate human-sized dolls racked here to maintain the pretense. The man's name was there on the tank's identification plates, immediately below the place where the spaghetti of life support connections entered. Martin Rhodes. and the code number which identified the specialties conditioned into him. He was an organizer, an executive, and another medical person, if that were a real person. Timberlake found his thoughts flitting from concept to concept. Person, persona. Does a persona provide a raison d'etre? That meant a reason to be. What's my reason for being? Timberlake studied the life system's telltales above the spaghetti sheaf. They registered a flat flame of life within the tank. Timberlake made a tiny adjustment in the oxygen meter, caught the immediate feedback surge on the tank's electroencephalographic coupling. The oxygen meter reset itself. This, then, was a hibernating man. That feedback reaction, with its elaborate encephalographic play, could not be programmed for the unexpected. The oxygen shift at this moment in time obviously could not have been anticipated. A human homeostat had detected it, though, and reacted correctly. Timberlake dropped down to the gridded catwalk, checked a tank opposite, and another farther down the line. He went through them at random, pausing only to check that each held a human being, He went through them at random, pausing only to check that each held a living human. Names leaped out at him from the ID tags. Tossa Lawn Nicky, Artemis Lawn St. John, Peter Lawn Vardak, Legata Lawn Hamill. One of them he recognized. Black hair, olive skin with its waxy undertone, chiseled features. Frank Lipera, a fellow student in human engineering. Presently, Timberlake went on to the next section, and the next. He found he recognized many of the occupants. This filled him with a feeling of loneliness. He felt that he might be the keeper of a museum, guarding old relics for a brief human lifespan, sequestering beneath these blue, cold lights a share of man's culture and knowledge. He came at last to a corner of Section 7, another recognizable face from his UMB past. Blonde and Germanic, pale wax skin. Timberlake read the name etched above the inspection port. Peabody, Allen, K7A. Yes, it was Al Peabody, Timberlake agreed. Yet, in a way, it wasn't Al. It was as though the companion of Timberlake's gym classes, his opponent in handball and moon tennis, had gone away somewhere to wait. But Peabody, Allen, K7A, proved to be a viable human with individual homeostatic reactions. He could be awakened to speak and act and think. He could be awakened to consciousness. And consciousness is a thing beyond speaking and acting and thinking, Timberlake thought. He loosed the handhold, dropped lightly back to the catwalk, feeling no particular need to check further. He knew with an inner certainty that all the tanks held hibernating humans. Bickle might be correct about the tin egg being an elaborate simulation, but in here the simulation went too far to be anything other than what it seemed. The hive tanks had not been larded with obvious deception. I was supposed to come through here, surprise Bickle, and stop him, Timberlake thought. Stop him from what? Some tiny, unregistered perception worked on the edge of Timberlake's awareness, assuring him that whatever Bickle was doing right now in the shop held no immediate danger to these helpless sleepers. Whatever Bickle's doing, he must be doing it right now, Timberlake thought. I've been gone almost an hour. He looked up at the rows of tanks. Yet every tank I checked was functioning at peak efficiency, as though the entire system were tuned to a critical optimum. Timberlake nodded to himself. You might almost think a mental core still rode monitor on the ship's vital parts. He felt that he could almost hear the tremendously slowed oscillations of life around him. The spot between his shoulder blades had ceased to itch, but he felt painfully tired now, slightly dizzy, his body dragging at his muscles. It occurred to Timberlake then that they could be going at the problem of reproducing consciousness too literally. Will we have to install mechanisms that permit the ox to grow tired? He wondered. We're too literal, like peasants asking the genie for 3 wishes. Maybe we won't like our wishes if we get them. God, I'm tired. Something moved near the far bulkhead, a space-suited figure. For one instant of unreality, Timberlake thought that one of his hibernating charges had revived itself. Then the moving figure came full into the glare of the cold light, and Timberlake recognized Flattery's features behind the anti-fog plate of the helmet bubble. "Tim!" Flattery called. His boots voimed. His voice boomed from the suit amplifiers, echoed with a metallic ringing through the cold air of the tank. "Something wrong with your suit receiver?" Flattery asked, stopping in front of Timberlake. Timberlake looked down at the command set near his chin, saw that its circuit indicator light was dark. I left it off, Timberlake thought. Never even thought of turning it on. Why'd I do that? Flattery studied Timberlake carefully. The man's motions when first seen across the tank had indicated nothing seriously wrong. He moved. He seemed aware of his surroundings. "You sure you feel all right, Tim?" Flattery asked. Sure, I feel all right." Like three wishes, Timberlake thought, like the 3 S's of our school joke: security, sleep, and sex. Something touched his shoulder, and he realized he had heard the inner bulkhead open. He looked around to see Bickle standing there. "You feel up to some work, Tim?" Bickle asked. "I need your help." Some carrier inflection of Bickle's voice, a subtly shaded overtone, told Timberlake that Bickle had been worried about him. But he must know I was sent through here to try to stop him. In that instant, Timberlake realized they were very close, the 3 of them standing here, and the closeness went beyond physical proximity. "Whatever you're doing, Bick," Timberlake said, "it's having no adverse effect on the hob tanks. Every sleeper I checked was humming along nicely." "Every—" Bickle nodded. "You found, Look for yourself," Timberlake said, realizing Bickle had not dared test his own suspicion that the hive tanks were a sham. "They're all occupied." "Excuse me." The politeness sounded odd coming out of Bickle's suit speaker. He jumped to an overhead handhold, swung to a ladder, and, oddly, picked the tank of Peabody Allen, K7A. Presently he worked his way along the K line of tanks, pausing only to peer into the inspection ports. He dropped back down to the catwalk near its center, returned to them. "All of them?" he asked, nodding back toward the other sections. "The only empty tank's the one that held Prue," Timberlake said. "Prue," Flattery said. "She's all alone in Comm Central." He thumbed the outside switch of his transceiver, changing circuits. They saw his lips move, but his voice was only a faint chatter. Bickle looked down, saw that he had ignored his command set. He flicked the switch, caught Prudence saying, "So far, but I don't like the idea of being all alone in here in case there's a real emergency." Bickle, too, preferred silence, Timberlake thought. He wanted a moment alone. Flattery returned his suit circuits to voice amplifier, looked questioningly at Bickle. Had we better be getting back?" Raj seems more relieved than Tim that these tanks are what they seem," Bickle thought. "Why? You don't want to check the tanks for yourself?" "I can take your word for it," Flattery said. "Can you?" "What's he doing?" Flattery wondered. "Is he trying to goad me?" Timberlake heard the derision in Bickle's voice, felt their moment of closeness shatter. Without moving their bodies, they had pulled apart. but Timberlake realized with an odd feeling of elation that he had aligned himself with Bickle. "This isn't an illusion," Flattery said. He waved at the tanks around them. "And you are conscious," Bickle said. Flattery suppressed a feeling of rage, but felt a sour taste in his mouth. "I will not let myself be goaded," he thought. "Of course I'm conscious." "Never apply 'of course' to consciousness," Bickle chided. "Consciousness can project illusions, insubstantial stimulus objects, onto the screen of your awareness." He motioned to the tanks above them. "Go ahead, check. We'll wait." Flattery felt stubborn now. "I will not." He started to push past Bickle. "Where are you going?" Bickle asked, catching the arm of Flattery's suit in one gloved hand. "The shortest way back, through the shop," Flattery said, "if you don't mind." He shook his arm free. "Be my guest," Bickle said, and stepped aside. Timberlake stared at Flattery as the psychiatrist chaplain wrenched the hatch dogs, opened the hatch, and slipped through to the next chamber. Flattery's fear was something other than worry about me, Timberlake realized. He's still afraid. Bickle took Timberlake's arm, helped him through, followed, and dogged the hatch. Flattery already was at the next hatch, had it open. Damn poor procedure, Timberlake thought, but he let it go. Presently they came to the inner locks and the back passage beneath the primary computer installation and up into the shop. They slipped through, sealed the hatch. Bickle threw back his helmet. Flattery and Timberlake did the same. Bickle already was loosening the glove seals. Timberlake stared at Flattery, watching the way the man studied the jutting boxes and angles, the interwoven leads of the ox. "Infinite counting net?" Flattery asked. "Why not?" Bickle asked. "You have it. You can count beyond the number of your own total nerve supply. The ox has to do the same." "Why not?" Bickle asked. "You have it. You can count beyond the number of your own total nerve supply. The ox has to do the same." "You know the danger," Flattery said. "Some of the danger," Bickle admitted. "This ship could be one gigantic sensory surface. Its receptors could achieve combinations unknown to us, could contact energy sources unknown to us." "Is that one of the theories?" Flattery took a step closer to the ox. "Before you do anything destructive," Bickle said, and he nodded toward the patterned confusion clinging to the computer wall with its wire tentacles, "you'd better know I'm already getting conscious-type reactions on a low scale, the system itself activating various sensors. It's like an animal blinking its eyes. A heat sensor here, audio there." "That could be a random dislodge pattern due to the shot effect bursts," Flattery said. "Not when nerve net activity accompanies each reaction." Flattery digested this, feeling his conditioned fear alertness, the reaction for which he was but a trigger, come to full amplitude. His memory focused on the two red keys and the self-destruction program they would ignite through the computer links of the ship. "Tim, how are you?" "Tim, how tired are you?" Bickle asked. Sorry. Timberlake looked at Bickle. "How tired am I?" Minutes ago he had been shot through with fatigue. Now something had keyed him up, filled him with elation. Conscious-type reactions. "I'm ready for another full shift." "This thing's too simple yet to even approach full consciousness," Bickle said. "Most of the ship's sensors bypass the aux circuits. Robot's controls aren't connected, and it has no—" "Just a minute," Flattery snapped. They turned, caught by the anger in Flattery's voice. "You admit this goal-seeking mechanism may operate entirely outside your control," Flattery said, "and you're still willing to give it eyes and muscles?" "Raj, before we're finished, this thing has to have complete control of the ship." "To get us across the big empty and safely to Tau Ceti," Flattery said. "You're assuming that's the ship computer's basic program?" "I assume nothing. I checked. That's the basic program." To Tau Ceti, Flattery thought. He felt like both laughing and crying. He didn't know whether to tell them the truth. The fools. But no, that would render them less efficient. Best to play the charade out to its silly conclusion. He took a deep breath to get himself under control. Okay, John, but you can't anticipate every goal of your ox unless we design all its goals into it, Timberlake answered. Flattery waved Timberlake into silence. That defeats your purpose. We'd have to foresee every possible danger, Bickle agreed. And it's precisely because we can't foresee every possible danger that we need this conscious awareness guiding the ship. It's hands on every control. Flattery reviewed the argument, trying to find a chink in Bickle's logic. The words merely echoed many of the UMB briefings to which Flattery had been subjected. You'll be required to find a survival technique in a profoundly changed environment. Remember, you can't foresee every new danger. Fail-safes won't work, of course, Flattery said. Same argument, Bickle said. Fail-safes work only when your dangers are known and anticipated. Can you prevent damage to the computer core? It'll be buffered 40 ways from Sunday. I've already started the buffering. The ship had an overriding supervisory program, Flattery said. A command to get us safely to Tau Ceti. You're sure of that? The command's there. They didn't fake it. What if it develops that it's fatal to go to Tau Ceti? Why is he quibbling? Bickle wondered. Surely he knows the answer to that. A simple binary decision solves that. We give it a turn-back alternative. Ah, Flattery said. The best of all possible moves, eh? But we're in the Queen's croquet game. You said it yourself. What if the Queen of Hearts changes the rules? We've no Alice in this wonderland to haul us back to reality. A deliberately poor move somewhere along the line changing the theoretical structure of the game, Bickle thought. That's an indicated possibility. He shrugged. Then we get sent to the headsman. Chapter 21. No distinct ideas occupied my mind. All was confused. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time. And it was, indeed, a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. Frankenstein's monster speaks. Prudence, at the controls less than an hour, already was beginning to feel the edge of fatigue which she knew would have her hanging on only by willpower at the end of her shift. Part of the load on her was the seemingly endless wordplay of those around her, the concept juggling. Words were so pointless in their situation. They needed action, determined, constructive action. Timberlake cleared his throat. He felt a powerful curiosity to inspect and test what Bickle had built, to trace out the circuitry and try to find out why it was not upsetting gross computer function. If we run into the Queen of Hearts problem, Timberlake said, the ship stands a better chance if it's controlled by an imaginative, conscious intelligence. Our kind of consciousness? Flattery asked. There's what's eating him, Bickle thought. He's obviously the one charged with seeing we don't lose a killer machine in the universe. Homeostasis for a race can be different from the balance needed to keep an individual alive. But we're isolated out here, an entire race in a test tube. We're talking about creating a machine with a specific quality, Flattery said. It has to operate itself from the inside by probability. We can't determine everything it's going to do. He raised a hand as Bickle started to speak. But we can determine some of its emotions. What if it actually cares about us? What if it admires and loves us? Bickle stared at him. That was an audacious idea, completely in keeping with Flattery's function as chaplain, colored by his psychiatric training and protective of the race as a whole. Think of consciousness as a behavior pattern, Flattery said. What has contributed to the development of this pattern? If we go back... His voice was drowned in the klaxon blare of the emergency warning. They all felt the ship lurch and the immediate weightlessness as all the... Oh, sorry. They all felt the ship lurch and the immediate weightlessness as the caged failsafe switch disconnected the grav system. Bickle drifted toward the forward end of the shop, caught a stanchion, swung himself around, and kicked off toward the comm central hatch, where he dislodged his lock. He went through the hatch in the same fluid motion of opening it, hurled himself toward his couch. He locked in, swept his gaze across his repeaters. Tim and Flattery were right behind. Prudence was making only minimal corrections on the big console, studying the drain gauges. Bickle saw that the computer was drawing almost 80% of its power capacity, began checking for fire and shorts. He heard cocoon triggers snap as Flattery and Timberlake took their places. "Computer drain," Timberlake said. "Radiation bleed off in stores 4, Prudence said, her voice hoarse. "Steady rise in temperature back of the second hull bulkheads. No, it's beginning to level off." She programmed for a hull security check, watched the sensor telltales. Bickle, looking over her shoulder at the big board, saw the implications of the flickering lights as soon as she did. "We've lost a section of our outer shielding." "And hull," she said. Bickle lay back, keyed the repeater screen for monitoring the sensors, began an analysis outward into the indicated area. "You watch the board, I'll make the check." Images flickered on and out in the little screen at the corner of his board as he keyed it to the new sensors further and further out. Halfway through Stores 4, he was staring into the star-sequined darkness of open space. The sensor eyes revealed foam coagulant flowing into a wide oval hole from the hull security automatics. Out of the corner of his eye, Bickle saw Flattery running a micro-survey along the edge of the break in the hull. "It's as though it were sliced off with a knife," he said, "smooth and even." "Meteorite?" Timberlake asked. He looked up from a check of the hype tanks. "There's no fusing at the edges or evidence of friction heat," Flattery said. He took his hands off his board, thinking of the island in Puget Sound, the wild destruction in the surrounding countryside. Rogue consciousness. Has it started already? "What could make that cut through the outer shielding and hull without heating them at least to half sun?" Bickle asked. No one answered. Bickle looked at Flattery, seeing the white, drawn look of the man's mouth, thought, "He knows. Raj, what could do that?" Flattery shook his head. Bickle took a reading on the laser-pulsed time log off his own repeaters, extracted a position assessment, noted transmission delay time to UMB, swung his transmitter to his side, and keyed it for AAT coding. "What are you doing?" Flattery asked. "This we'd better report," Bickle said. He began cutting the tape. "How about some gravity?" Timberlake asked. He looked at Prudence. "System reads functional," she said. "I'll try it." She thumbed the reset. The ship's normal quarter gravity pulled at them. Timberlake unlocked his cocoon, stepped out to the deck. "Where are you going?" Prudence asked. "I'm going out to have a look," Timberlake said. "Some force takes a slice off our hull without crisping the area or spreading the shadow pattern? There's no such force. This I've got to see." "Stay right where you are," Bickle said. "There could be loose cargo out there. Anything." Timberlake thought of lovely Maida crushed by runaway cargo. He swallowed. "What's to prevent it slicing us neatly right down the middle next time?" Prudence asked. What's our speed, Prue? Timberlake asked.
C over 1527 and holding.
Did whatever it was slow us at all?
Flattery asked.
Prudence ran the back check on the comparison log.
No.
Timberlake took a deep, quavering breath. A virtually zero impact phenomenon with a force effect of what? Infinity? He shook his head. There's no kinetic equivalent. Bickle tripped the transmission switch, waited for the interlock, looked at Timberlake. Did the universe begin with Gamow's Big Bang, or are we in the middle of Hoyle's continuous creation? What if they're both?
That's just a mathematical game, Prudence said. Oh, I know. The union of infinite mass and finite source can be accomplished by postulating zero impact, infinite force, but it's still just a mathematical game, a canceling out exercise. It doesn't prove anything. It proves the original power of Genesis.
It proves the original power of Genesis, Flattery whispered.
Oh, Raj, you're at it again, Prudence remonstrated, trying to twist mathematics to prove the existence of God.
God took a swipe at us? Timberlake asked. Is that what you're saying, Raj?
You know better than to take that attitude under these circumstances, Flattery retorted. When they get that message at UMB, they'll know we've achieved the stage of rogue consciousness. There's no other answer.
You were going to make a guess, Bick, Timberlake said. Bickle watched the signal timer creep around its circle. It had a long way to go yet before giving them the blip that would tell them the message had enough time to reach its mark. Maybe some kind of interface phenomenon that exists only out here in the Trans-Saturnian area, Bickle said. A field effect, maybe, from pressure waves originating in the solar convection zone. The universe contains a hell of a lot of oscillatory motion. Maybe we've hit a new combination.
Is that what you suggested to UMB? Flattery asked.
Yes.
What if it isn't
a mathematical game? Timberlake asked. Could we program for a probability curve to predict the limits of such a hypothetical phenomenon? Bickle lifted his hands from the AAT keyboard, considered Timberlake's question. Such a program could be figured in matrix functions, he felt. It was something like their hunt for the consciousness factor, trying to trace an exceedingly complex system on the basis of scant data. They could approach it through stacks of linear simultaneous equations, each defining parallel hyperplanes in n-dimensional space. What about that, Prue? He asked. She saw where Bickle's imagination had led them, and she took a trial run in her mind, visualizing the diagonal entries when they appeared as coefficients of the simultaneous equations. The entire process was over in seconds, but she held herself to silence, savoring the experience. It was a new one. She had set up a programming simulation in her mind, checked it out, and filed the results in memory, recalling the bits precisely where she needed them. It was a feat of which she had never thought herself capable. Her own mind. A computer. She told Bickle what had happened, replayed the results for him. Bickle found himself filling in the gaps where she skipped over the process to the answers. Somewhere, probably in the long skull sessions back at UMB, he had absorbed an enormous amount of esoteric math. Necessity and Prue's lead had pushed him over onto a plateau where that knowledge became available. He felt suddenly robust, inches taller. The mental effort had lifted him to a hyper-awareness, relaxed yet ready, aware of his entire vasculomuscular state and emotional tone. The sensation began to fade. Bickle sensed the ship and its pressures on him, the steady, solid motion of matter bound outward from the sun. The entire experience had taken less than half a minute. Bickle felt raging sadness as the sensation faded. He thought he had experienced something infinitely precious, and part of the experience remained with him in memory.
It was like a thin thread linking him to the experience, holding out the hope of once more following that thread. But the pressure of the ship and those around him wouldn't permit the indulgence. He realized abruptly that he carried some enormous weight within him that might shatter that precious thread completely, and this sent a pang of fear through him. "Do you think such a program's possible?" Timberlake pressed. "Programming it is out," Bickle snapped. "We can't limit the variables." He turned back to the AAT keyboard, began punching out the message with savage motions. Bickle thought about the Bickle thought about the alterations he had made to the computer system. Black box, white box. The ignition of this thing they were building required a black box, and there was only one obvious black box to give itself over to the imprinting process on the computer's white box. A human brain. I will be the pattern. Would the computer/thing then be another Bickle? Prudence stared up at the big console, wondering at Bickle's sudden anger, using the focus on this as an excuse for not thinking about what had happened to the ship. But she couldn't avoid that problem. The damage had been caused by something outside the ship. There had been a faint lurch transmitted through the tin egg, but that had come afterward. The damage telltales already had been flaring out red and yellow. The lurch had been associated with power drain and a shift of switching equipment to the necessities of automatic damage control. Zero impact, infinite force. Something outside the ship had sliced through them like a razor through soft butter. No, infinitely sharper. Something from outside. She put a hand to her cheek. That pointed to something beyond the dangers programmed into the ship. They'd encountered something out of the wide, blank unknown. She thought suddenly of sea monsters painted on ancient charts of the earth, of 12-legged dragons and humanoid figures with fanged mouths in their chests. She restored a degree of calmness by reminding herself that all these monsters had faded before humanity's monkey-like inquisitiveness. Still, something had struck the tin egg. She ran another visual survey of her board, noting that automatic damage control had almost completely flooded out Stores 4 with foam seal. Section doors were sealed off for 2 layers around the damage area. Whatever had hit them, it had taken only a thin slice. This time. Bickle raised his hand to the transmitter pulse switch, depressed it. The room around him filled with the hum of the instrument as it built up the energy to hurl its multiburst of information back across space. The snap-click of one of the transmission interlock with its dim smell of ozone came almost as an anticlimax. "They won't make any more of this than we do," Timberlake said. "UMB has some of the top men in particle physics," Bickle said. "Maybe they can solve it." "A neutrino phenomenon?" Bickle asked. "Nuts! They'll claim we misread the evidence." "Time for my watch," Flattery said. "Prue?" Flattery's words made her aware in a sudden rush of acceptance how tired she was. Her back ached and the muscles of her forearms trembled. She could remember only once before having been this tired, after almost 5 hours of surgery. In many ways, she was making too heavy demands on her flesh, with long watches, work in the shop, and the tests using her own body as a guinea pig. But the adrenochrome THC was proving difficult. It wouldn't cross the blood-brain barrier into active contact with the neural tissue, unless she dared use a near-fatal dosage. She hadn't yet dared, although the prize appeared dazzling. If she could only inhibit the lower structures of the brain and release the higher structures to full activity, she could hand Bickle the sequential steps to duplicate as electronic functions. "Shift the board on the count," she said. As they shifted the big board, Flattery scanned the instruments, preparing to fit himself into the mood of the ship. And the tin egg does have her moods. Sometimes he felt as though the ship carried ghosts within it, of the 16 clones killed by accident during the construction on the moon, of umbilicus crew members killed by the ship's programmed savagery, or perhaps of the OMCs sacrificed on this altar. An altar to human hubris, those previous tests, all of the dead crews, colonists, and the OMCs. All ghosts riding with us. Did those bodiless brains have souls? Flattery wondered. For that matter, if we breathe consciousness into this machinery, will our creation have a soul? Have the automatics finished sealing the brake? Bickle asked. All sealed, Flattery said, and he asked himself, when will the rogue consciousness hit us again? What was in stores for? Prudence asked. What did we lose? Food concentrates, Bickle answered. First thing I checked. His tone said, you had the watch, you should have checked that. Raj, do you want us to start sharing watch and what? Raj, do you want us to start sharing watch and watch? That's what it says. Raj, do you want us to start sharing watch and watch? ? Timberlake asked. After I've had some rest. After you've had some rest, you can help me in the shop. Flattery glanced at Bickle, then at Timberlake, wondering how the life systems engineer would take that rebuke. Timberlake had his eyes closed. His fatigue was obvious in the pale, flaccid look of his face. He appeared almost asleep, except for tight, shallow breathing. You want to go right ahead, eh? Prudence asked. You don't think we should wait for Hempstead's trained SEALs to chew this over? Whatever hit us came from outside, Bickle said. That's another problem. John's right, Timberlake rasped. He cleared his throat, unsnapped his action couch, sat up. I'm bushed. We've just decided, Prudence said, just like that. She snapped her fingers. That you can go on stirring around in the computer like a wild man? For Christ's sake, Bickle said. Haven't any of you realized yet we were supposed to use the computer as the basic element of attack? Bickle stared around at them, Flattery busy on the board. Timberlake half asleep, sitting up at his couch, Prudence glaring at him from her couch. That's no ordinary computer. It has elements we don't even suspect. It was hooked up with an organic mental core for almost 6 years during the construction and programming of the ship. It has buffers and leads and cross ties that its own designers may not even know about. Are you suggesting it's already conscious? Prudence asked. No, I'm only suggesting that we've come a long way using that computer in our aux frontal lobe simulator. We've come further than the UMB project did in 20 years. No, I'm just going to take it from the top. I'm sorry. No, I'm suggesting that we've come a long way using that computer in our aux frontal lobe simulator. We've come further than the UMB project did in 20 years. And we should go on with this. We're cutting a straight line through. There are no straight lines in nature, Flattery said. Bickle sighed. What now? He wondered. If you've got something to say, spit it out. Consciousness is a type of behavior, Flattery said. Agreed. But the roots of our behavior are buried so far away in the past we can't get at them directly. Emotion again, eh? Bickle demanded. No, Flattery said. Instinct, Prudence said. Flattery nodded. The kind of genetic imprint that tells a chicken how to crack out of its shell. Emotions or instinct? What's the difference? Bickle asked. Emotions are produced by instinct. And you still saying we can't... Oh, sorry. Emotions are produced by instinct. Are you still saying we can't bring the ox to consciousness unless it has instincts cum emotions? You know what I'm saying, Flattery said. It has to love us. Bickle said. He chewed at his upper lip, caught again by the beautiful simplicity of that suggestion. Flattery was right, of course. Here was a loose rein that could satisfy the fail-safe requirements. It controlled without galling. It has to have an autonomic system of emotional reactions, Flattery said. The system has to respond with a set of physical effects of which the ox is aware. Emotion, Bickle thought, the characteristic that gives us our sense of person, the thing that summates personal judgments, a process in capsule form that can occur out of sequence. Here was a break with all machine concepts of time, emotion as process, an audacious way of looking at time. There's nothing of ourselves about which we can be objective, Bickle said, except our own physical responses. Remember? It's what Dr. Ehlers was always saying. Flattery thought back to Ehlers, UMB's chief of psych. Bickle is purpose, the force that will give direction to your search, Ehlers had said. You have substitutes, of course. Accidents do happen. But you've nothing honed as fine as Bickle. He's a creative discoverer. A creative discoverer. The failures of all who went before him, all of those clone brothers, all was preparation for this assault on the problem. If we succeed, we survive, and if we fail... And Bickle was thinking, emotion. How do we symbolize it and program for it? What does the body do? We're inside in direct contact with whatever the body's doing. That's the only thing we can really be objective about. What does the body... It has to have a completely interfunctioning body, Bickle said, seeing the whole problem and answer as an abrupt revelation. It has to have a body that's gone through trauma and crises. He stared at Flattery. Guilt, too, Raj. It has to have guilt. Guilt? Flattery asked, and wondered why the suggestion made him feel angry and half fearful. He started to object, grew conscious of a rhythmic rasping. He thought at first it was a malfunctioning alarm, realized then it was Timberlake. The life systems engineer had reclasped himself in his action couch cocoon. He was asleep, snoring. Guilt, Bickle said, holding his attention on Flattery. How? Prudence asked. In program engineering terms, Bickle said, we must install trapping functions, inner alarm systems, monitors that interrupt operations according to the functional needs of the entire system. Guilt's an artificial emotion. It has nothing to do with consciousness, Flattery objected. Fear and guilt are parent and child. You can't have guilt without fear. But you can have fear without guilt, Flattery said. Can you? Bickle asked, and he thought, it's the Cain and Abel syndrome. Where'd the race pick that one up? Not so fast, Prudence said. Are you suggesting we install that we make this ox afraid? Yeah, absolutely not, Flattery said. He had his couch exerciser going, but shut it off, turned to stare at Bickle. Our creature already has a large, fast memory, Bickle said. It has fixed memory, if you discount our addressing problems. If you discount our addressing problems, which aren't interfering with function at any rate. No, I had it right the first time. Emphasis on the right syllable makes a difference here in meaning. It has fixed memory, if you discount our addressing problems, which aren't interfering with function at any rate. And I'll bet this thing is a protected area of memory that's even ready with illusions when they're necessary for self-protection. But fear, Flattery said. This is the other side of your coin, Raj. You want it to love us? Okay. Love's a kind of need, eh? I'm willing to give it a need for external program sources. That's us, you understand. I'll leave the necessary gaps in its makeup that only we can fill. It'll have emotions, but that means an unlimited spectrum of emotions, Raj. The spectrum includes fear. Guilt and fear, Prudence thought. Raj will have to face it. She looked at Bickle, seeing the filmed-over, withdrawn look in his eyes. Pleasure and pain, Bickle muttered. He focused on Prudence, the sleeping Timberlake, on Flattery, each in turn. Did they see that the ox had to be able to reproduce itself, too? Prudence felt her pulse quickening, tore her attention away from Bickle. She put a hand to her temple, checked the pulse there, related this to her quickened breathing, to body temperature, to hungers, to stage of fatigue and awareness. The chemical experiments on her body were giving her an acute awareness of her bodily functions, and that awareness told her she needed chemical readjustment. Well, Raj, Bickle said. I must compose myself, Flattery thought, turning back onto his couch. I must appear natural and calm. He kept his eyes away from the false panel on his repeater board. Under that panel lay death and destruction. Bickle was growing exceedingly alert to the tiniest clues. Flattery marked the quiet green of the flashboard, the ticking of relays through the graph counters. Everything about the ship felt soothing and ordinary. Flattery felt, all systems functioning. Everything about the ship felt soothing and ordinary, all systems functioning. Yet deep inside himself, Flattery felt knotted up, like an animal poised at the sound of the hunter. Pleasure and pain. It could be done, of course. The gradual orientation toward a goal, then denial, interference, removal, frustration, threat of destruction. I'm going back to the shop, Bickle said. The way to do this is pretty clear, isn't it? Perhaps to you, Flattery said. There's no stopping, Prudence said, and hoped Flattery heard the implication. There's no stopping him. Go ahead, Flattery said. Assemble your blocks of NerveNet simulators, but let us think long and hard before we tie your system into the full computer. He looked at Bickle. Do you still contemplate this black box, white box experiment? Bickle merely stared at him. You know the danger, Flattery said. Bickle felt elation, a breakthrough in some inner factor that had resisted him. The ship, its living organisms, its problems, all were like marionettes and marionette toys. The way out was so clear to him. He'd only hinted at it before. So clear. He could see the necessary schematics stacked in his mind, like transparencies piled one on another. Four-dimensional construction, he reminded himself. We have to construct a net in depth that contains complex world-line tracks. It has to absorb non-synchronous transmissions. It has to abstract discrete patterns out of the impulse oversend. The important thing is structure, not the material. The important thing is topology. That's the key to the whole damn problem. Prue, give me a hand, Bickle said. He glanced at the chronometer beside the comm central board, looked at Timberlake. Let him sleep. Prue could help. She did need electronics work, surgical in its exactness, clean and with minimal leads and tight couplings. We're going to need a coupling area for each group of multiple blocks, Bickle said, looking at Prudence. I'm going to turn that job over to you while I build up the major block systems. As though his words had accumulated in her mind, built up a certain pressure until they spilled over into understanding, she saw what Bickle intended. He was going to feed a continuous data load into an enormously expanded aux-cum computer link-up. He was going to project into the computer, like a film projected on a screen, a giant spread out, an almost infinite psychospace. The array of required connectives set themselves up in her mind, with parallel rows of binary numbers, cross-linked, interwoven. And she saw that she could reframe the problem, overlap it with matrix functions. creating a problem solution array like a multi-dimensional chessboard. In the instant of this revelation, she realized that Bickle could not have framed his approach to this solution without using the same mathematical crowbar to lever away the heavy work. "You used adjacency matrices," she accused. He nodded. She had seen that he was intruding into a new mathematical conception, a calculus of qualities by which he could trace neuron impulses and juggle them within the embedded psychospaces of the Oxcombe computer. Prudence had begun to see what he saw, but the others weren't ready yet for anything more than hints. The possibilities were staggering. The implied methods would permit construction of entirely new computers, reduced in size and basic complexity by a factor of at least 1,000. But more important was the understanding this gave him of his own psychospaces and their function in abstraction, the aggregate nerve cell excitation of his own body, and the way this was reduced to recognizable values. I feel like I skipped a line. I'm going to reread that paragraph. I have a sinking feeling I skipped a line. Someone will find out after the fact if I did or not. The reason I say that is because somewhere in there, my brain got lost, and I just went full automatic and winged it. So I might have gotten the whole thing in there, because that's a long chunk of what appears to be complete gibberish, or technobabble, or something. If there's any sense to be made out of that, somebody please inform me. Prudence had begun to see what he saw. Prudence had begun to see what he saw. No, Prudence had begun to see what he saw on the seesaw by the seashore. Sorry. Oh, morning, Cookie. Thanks for tuning in. We're just having a critical brain failure here. I'm losing my mind. Prudence had begun to see what he saw, but the others weren't ready yet for anything more than hints. The possibilities were staggering. The implied methods would permit construction of entirely new computers, reduced in size and basic complexity by a factor of at least 1,000. But more important was the understanding this gave him of his own psychospaces and their function in abstraction, the aggregate nerve cell excitation of his own body, and the way this was reduced to recognizable values. Thinking within this framework, Bickle saw, put him on a threshold. A certain pressure here, a certain application of energy there, and he knew he would be projected into a consciousness that he had never before experienced. The realization inspired fear and awe, and at the same time it lured him. He turned, crossed to the hatch into the shop, opened it, looked back at Flattery. "Raj," he said, "we're not conscious." "What? What? Huh?" It was Timberlake rousing out of his sleep, rubbing his eyes, staring straight out at Bickle. "We're not awake," Bickle said. And here we get to more of how this is like I I'm reasonably certain I should ask Peter Watts. He responds often on his blog. I should ask Peter Watts if he had read Destination Void beforehand and it influenced him in the creation of Blindsight, because this is definitely dealing with some similar subject matter in terms of, how conscious are we really? It's touched on it before already, and now it's going to delve a bit deeper into it and bounce around a bit. Chapter 22. Beyond the senses there are objects. Beyond objects there is mind. Beyond the mind there is intellect. Beyond the intellect there is the great self. Katha Upanishad, excerpt for instruction of chaplain psychiatrists. We're not awake. During Flattery's watch, the words haunted him. Timberlake had muttered something about "damn joker," and gone off to finish his sleep in quarters. But Flattery, dividing his attention between the console and the overhead screen that showed the shop with Prudence and Bickle at work there, felt the ship assume a curious identity in his mind. He felt as though he and the others were merely cells of a larger organism, that the telltales, the dials and gauges and sensors, the omnipresent visual intercom, all these were senses and nerves and organs of something apart from himself. We are not awake. We are not awake. We keep skirting that thought, Flattery reflected. Bickle's voice talking to Prudence in the shop. Here's the main trunk to handle negative feedback. Follow the color code and tie it in across there. Here's the damper circuit. We have to watch we don't introduce reverberating cycles into the random neural paths. And Prudence, talking half to herself. The human skull encloses about 15,000 million neurons. I've extrapolated from our building blocks and the computer. We're going to wind up with more than twice that number in this beast. Their voices were like echoes in Flattery's mind. Bickle. Think of a threshold to be overcome. Several kinds of pressure will overcome that threshold. They're the pressures involved in entropy, or the pressures of proliferating variability. Call that one life. Entropy on one side, life on the other. Each drives past the threshold at a certain pressure level. When one gets through, that turns on the consciousness factor. Prudence. Which is it, homeostat or filter? Bickle. Both. Flattery thought then of the total ship, the great machine whose continued life required a certain optimum organization, an ordering process. That involved entropy, certainly, because the system of a total ship tended to settle into a uniform distribution of its energies. As far as the ship is concerned, order is more natural than chaos, Flattery thought. But we're playing the ship as though all its parts were an orchestra and Bickle the director. Bickle alone has the score to achieve the music we want. Consciousness. Bickle. I tell you, Prue, consciousness has to be something that flows against the current of time, time in which it's embedded. Prudence. I don't know. When a cell block fires, that sets up an impulse. The impulse divides and forms a multi-branched structure with a single stem. In the nerve nets, the embedding space. The stem contains that original firing, of course, and you have transmission shooting out through four-dimensional space. It includes time. Bickle. And consciousness is like a boat breasting that flow. Prudence. Against that flow? You have to include time in the diagram, certainly, but the firing and branching are like a complex solid pushed into time, like the veins in a four-dimensional leaf. Bickle. Think of the ship's AAT system. What's that? The thing takes hundreds of duplicates on a single message, all the duplicates having been transmitted in a single compressed burst, a single firing, and it slows them down, compares them, breaks off the error stems, and passes along to you the translated, corrected message. I'm going to stop here again and say that sounds an awful lot like what I've been given to understand a large language model or even the picture generating AI's work. So he pretty much called it for this kind of a system. Not for creating consciousness, mind you, but for how this AAT system would work. Unfortunately, I think the thing that isn't really done. Well, he kind of mentions it, but it's like, yeah, the farther out you go, the less accurate it's ultimately going to become because the signal gets scattered more. But it's not necessarily taking into account that it's going to pump forth what it thinks you want to hear, and it doesn't know anything about reality or context. So it's just going to pump forth whatever. But you know, that's pretty organic in its way. Anyway, back on track. Prudence. But consciousness doesn't enter the picture until the message reaches its human receiver. Bickle. Negative feedback, Prue. Input adjusted to the output. If the system malfunctions, the human operator repairs it, like repairing a dam in a stream so you catch a significant amount of the flow. Prudence, looking up from a length of neuron fiber she was feeding into a micromanipulator. Consciousness, a kind of negative feedback? Bickle. You ever think, Prue, that negative feedback is the most terrifying perfectionist in the universe? It won't permit failure. It's designed to keep the system running between certain limits no matter what the disturbance. Prudence. But these aux circuits, you've deliberately introduced errors that aren't. Bickle. Why not? All our conventional ideas about feedback imply a certain uniformity of environment, but we live in a non-uniform universe. That place out there isn't completely predictable. We've got to keep it off balance out there by changing the rules ourselves at random. Order opposed to chaos, Flattery thought, glancing at the overhead screen. Lord, how that block upon block extrusion was spreading out from the computer wall. It had proliferated into two major growths with a jungle of vine-like pseudo-neuron sheaths between them and around them and over them. Bickle lay on his back, working beneath the structure. Loops of the main bus connections hung down just above his knees. We are not awake, Flattery thought. Oh, God, how easy it'd be to give up right now. He was here in the driver's seat, wasn't he? One of the triggers was at hand. Who'd ever know? The ship would die. The problem end. Let the bastards at UMB try again. With somebody else. But that was the real problem. They'd try again, all right, but not with somebody else. The same miserable charade, over and over and over. Look at Prue down there, he thought. She's stopped her anti-S injections. She's experimenting with her body chemistry. She'll be posturing and twisting in front of Bickle pretty soon. And the only way he sees her is as an expert with the micromanipulator. She does good work. We are not awake. Consciousness itself created variety, developed offshoot probabilities. Consciousness itself created variety, developed offshoot probabilities, and variety thrived on variety. The very act of playing their own special music produced the unpredictable, produced errors. Where does communication break down? Bickle, grunting as he squirmed out from beneath the ox. The generalized body and the specialized brain, Prue. Put 'em together and what have you got? Illusion. That's the buffer. Illusion. It's the protective layer that gets virtually incompatible systems to get in bed together. Oh, it's the protective layer that it's the protective layer that lets virtually incompatible systems get in bed together. Consciousness is a producer of illusions. Prudence. Where'd you store the R4-DBD neuron reel? Bickle. Second rack, left end of the bench. Now, you take the illusion of central position. Prudence. That's the natural result of a baby's helpless dependence on its environment. A baby is the center of the universe. We never lose that memory. Bickle. Well, individual sense impressions are something like pebbles dropped in a four-dimensional pond. Consciousness locks onto the waves created by those pebbles and gives them a spatial and temporal integration so they can be interpreted. Consciousness has to make sense out of things, but its major tool is illusion. Spatio-temporal integration, Flattery thought. The identity that was the ship, their tin egg, it lacked... Yes, no, I read that correctly. The identity that was the ship, their tin egg, it lacked a certain integrating ability at the moment. Instead of an efficient self-regulating force, the ship was making do with the inadequate feedback system represented by four humans loosely connected to its nervous system. That was one way of looking at it. But there was a point in the ship's future where damage passed beyond their ability to recover. The humans were failing. Flattery felt then a deep bitterness toward the society that had sent this frail cargo into nowhere. He knew the reasons, but reasons had never prevented bitterness. Think of society as a human construction, a very sophisticated defense mechanism. Hempstead and his cohorts had said, society's restrictions get bred into the cells themselves by a process of selection, and these restrictions become part of the self-regulating feedback in society's governing systems. There's a serious question whether humans actually can break out of their self-regulated pattern. It takes audacious methods indeed to explore beyond that pattern. The law was stated, Flattery knew, thusly: individual human experience is not the overriding control factor in human behavior. The cellular social pattern dominates. Flattery deliberately rapped his knuckles against the edge of his action couch to shock him out of this reverie. He focused on the console, saw he had the usual temperature adjustments to make. The automatics could never quite hold the line. Bickle. Watch those lengths in the time delay circuits. You'll confuse the ox's psychological present. Prudence. It's what? Bickle. It's psychological present. It's specious present. What you experience in any given instant. That short interval you call now. Professor Farrell. Remember old Professor Farrell Barrel? Prudence. Who could forget Hempstead's son-in-law? Bickle. Yeah, but he wasn't stupid. We were on the satellite tracker once. Him on his side of this sterile wall, him on his side of the sterile wall and me on ours. And he said, "Look at that thing move." It was a shuttle ship coming in from Earth. And he said, "You know for a fact it's changing position fast as hell, but you seem to see all the position changes right now, in the present. No sharp edges, just a flow. That's the specious present, boy. Don't you ever forget it." And I never did. Prudence. Will the ox really experience time? Bickle. It has to. Our time delay circuits have to give it a way of internal measurement. It has to feel its own time. Otherwise, it'll be a big package of confusion. Prudence. The now. Bickle. You think about it and you realize we don't interpret You think about it and you realize we don't interpret the immediate experience of time. We take big gulps of time. But real time now, that has to be something gradual and progressive, a smooth change against a background of some measurement constant. Prudence. So we line up the ox's physical time and set it going like some mechanical toy, in one direction. Bickle. The more remote parts of its specious present have to fade the way they do with us. The past has to be less intense than what's just appearing on the horizon. It needs a constant serial fade-out. Otherwise, it won't be able to distinguish points near in time from points remote in time. Flattery looked up into the screen, saw Bickle hook an oscilloscope to the ox, run a pulse check. Entropy, Flattery thought. One direction in time. He projected a picture in his mind. Jets of water. One labeled entropy and the other that was thrusting. One labeled entropy and the other that thrusting probabilism they called life. Balanced between the two like a ball on a fountain danced consciousness. It's so simple, Flattery thought, but how do you reproduce it? Unless you're God. Bickle. Hold on there. Don't hook in that layer without running your step-down test. Prudence. You and your damn caution. Bickle. Life is a very cautious proposition. An error in those step-down circuits could screw us up royally. Remember this. Ox has to take complicated inputs and filter them down through simpler and simpler integrating systems until it finally displays the results as symbols on which to act. Think of your own sense of vision. How many receptor neurons in your retina? Prudence. About 120 million? Bickle. But when the system gets back to the ganglion layer, how many cells there? Prudence. Only about 1.25 million. Only about 1.25 million. Bickle. Stepped down, see? Stepped down, see? The system takes hordes of sense impressions and combines them into fewer and fewer discrete signals. In the end, we get a sense datum called an image. But we interpret that image out of an enormous file of topological comparisons, all of them out of previously translated experience. Prudence. And you think our computer has enough experiences for that kind of comparison? Bickle. It will have when we're through with it. And Flattery thought, black box, white box. Prudence. Aren't you likely to overload the computer? Bog it down? Bickle. For Christ's sakes, woman, you personally receive all kinds of information constantly. Doesn't your own system sort through all that information, queue it up, program it, and evaluate the data? Prudence. But the tin egg's very existence depends on the computer. If we blunder with... Bickle. There's no other way. You should have realized that the instant you saw this whole ship was a set piece. Prudence, angrily. What do you mean? Why? Bickle. Because the computer's the only place where that amount of information can be stored. You see, woman, we don't have time to train a completely uneducated infant. Before she could answer, the transmission horn blared its warning. The AAT stood on manual bypass to keep its circuits from interfering with the work in the shop. The horn's trigger fired both Bickle and Flattery into action. Bickle threw the action switch in the shop. Flattery slapped the AAT master control switch on his console, realizing with a sense of detachment that the UMB messages would pour through the aux circuits before being displayed for them. And that is going to do it for today. Hope people enjoyed. Sorry it was so rough. If anyone tuning in for the first time is wondering why it's so rough, or listening to this after the fact, is wondering why it's so rough, it's because I do these live. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at noon. Eastern Standard Time, or East Coast US time, or UTC -5. So if you want to catch me live and that time slot is available to you, you can. If you just want to tune into them after the fact, that's totally okay too. I don't care. Either is fine for me. Whatever works for you. That's why I make sure they are up on the YouTubes, and saved, because that way they can be accessed. That's why I organize them, albeit only once a month, to make sure they're in their own playlists. So yeah, things are moving along with Destination Void. We've got about two more until that is done. Next Monday, we will be doing more of Armor by John Stakely. We'll probably be getting to about the halfway point of the book, give or take. Nearly, anyway. And then on Wednesday, we'll be reading a little short book called Termush, or Termush, by Sven Holm. It's a cute one. I rather enjoy it. I would compare it favorably to, because it's got kind of this off-putting vibe, and slightly poetic vibe. I'd compare it to Jeff Vandermeer. So if you like his stuff, he actually writes an introduction to the book, which I'm not going to read because it spoils half of it. I might read it afterward. I don't know. It probably won't. But he writes an introduction to it. At any rate, that'll about do it. And next Friday we'll be doing more Destination Void.
because we're making headway. Making headway, boys and girls. It'll be good once we get there. After we're done with Destination Void, and after I've returned from my perambulations for the first 2 weeks of August, we'll get cracking on The Three Body Problem by Shishin Ryu. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, that's about it. That'll do it for me. Hope people enjoyed. If you didn't enjoy, I'm sorry. If you did enjoy, great. I'm glad you enjoyed. That's it. That's all I demand of you, is to have experienced it. To merely exist in your own conscious flow state. Um, I don't require you to like or upvote or follow or any of that. If you want to, you can, for your convenience. But otherwise, juking the algorithm is not a primary goal of mine. Juking the algorithm and playing that particular game is not my desired end goal. I don't need this to make money. I don't do it to make money. I do this for my own self-gratification, if I'm honest. That other people appear to enjoy it as well is awesome. That's all I ask. Uh, it's a nice self-justification, really. It's really nice. Anyway, I'm gonna dip. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. See you all later. Until next time, toodles.